Welcome back, everybody. Appreciate you tuning in for last week's episode. This week we wanted to take it a little bit different. We kind of gave you a where we've been, where we're going, who we are, and really what drives us. Today we wanted to do something. Sean and I wanted to do something that was I'd say more near and dear to our heart. We can talk about products, we can talk about company, we can talk about a lot of those things. But this right here is really it's what brought us together. Well, I guess thanks to Twitter, probably 4 years ago.
Yeah.
4 years ago, Sean had sent me a message. We'd connected, followed back and forth. He had seen what I was doing with the Next Level Ag soil sampling and swap maps, and was just intrigued, wanted to learn more. One conversation led to another, and I guess we became friends out of the deal. So I guess we have this soil test to thank for bringing us together. But really what we wanted to do is just unpack a indicator complete soil sample. So for those of you that participated in Agronomy 365, you saw a indicator complete soil test. You also would have got a tissue test. With that, you might have been slightly overwhelmed. If it's the first time that you have looked at an indicator complete soil sample, you're probably looking at this and saying, boy, this is nothing like what I'm used to. So whether you used a Bray P1, whether you used a malic extract, whether it was an Olsen extract, maybe it was ammonium acetate for your calcium, for potassium, whatever it was, what I had done is a traditional soil test, and I mean traditional, is one that has been widely used, widely accepted, as this right here on the left-hand side. So what you're looking at is the left-hand side is the chemical extract or the chemical component, the right-hand side is the biological. It's easy to get overwhelmed. I completely understand it. There's 48 different metrics that we're measuring here that we're looking at with an indicator complete versus 12 on a standard soil test.
Yeah.
So Sean came from the world that you know, I think he felt like and we've had conversations, you know, he said, I could make a recommendation in a matter of 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
45 seconds on looking at a soil test, on a traditional soil test. And he said, you know, now that you brought this mess to me, he said, I can't make one in an hour. And so I'm sure that if this is something that you're not doing every day, that you're not studying every day, you're probably looking at this and saying, what are the critical components? What do I need to be focused on? What is it telling me? And why do you have both of these? So lucky for you, today we're going to unpack that. So I'm going to let Sean go ahead and just kind of talk about that left-hand side of the soil test, what he's looking at, things to pay attention to, and what he would be doing managing just off of that.
Sure. Thanks, Bodie. So I guess I'm classically trained in soil fertility using whether it's the University of Illinois agronomy handbook method or the tri-state method that comes from, you know, Purdue, Ohio State, Michigan State, I think. And a lot of the similar things, our approaches are very similar. So we've got an organic matter. You know, we just general rule of thumb that I see a 3% organic matter and I say, well, that's pretty good. Because, you know, where I'm at in Southeast Illinois, we see a lot of anywhere from, you know, 0.8 to, you know, maybe 2 or 3. And if we see 3+, that's usually in our black ground that doesn't drain very well. So we're not really accustomed to seeing good organic matter levels. I see a surface nitrogen. So this test is taken on a 0 to 6 inch sample. So I just see some real basic, you know, say there's 16 pounds of N in that 0 to 6 inch a sample. We go to phosphorus. So this is where you go classically trained and you talk about making a quick recommendation. I see, okay, I got a Bray P1, part per million of 35.1 parts per million. So we're in Illinois, where I'm at. So we do everything in pounds per acre. So, okay, 35.1 times 2 is 70 pound to the acre of phosphorus. And so instantly I look at that and say, I'm not applying any phosphorus on this soil. I think our basic recommendations at Tri-State's 15 part per million, so around 30 pound to the acre is kind of a cutoff on applications. University of Illinois recommendations I think are still somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 50 pound to the acre is maybe a maintenance. Anything above 50, we're not going to apply any phosphate fertilizer. I look at potassium, again, part per million, it's 150 times 2. So I look at that and say, okay, that's a 300 pound to the acre potassium score. I can't remember the tri-states right off the top of my head, but I know the University of Illinois for Southeast Illinois and our low CEC soils that we have. I look at that, it's 300 pound to the acre, so I'm building to, if I'm trying to build, I'm going to build to maybe 260. And so I'm saying, okay, even though I may be, just off the cuff real quick, even if I'm 40 pounds higher than what that build number is, we all know that potassium is a tough metric to build in the soil. So I may still apply, 75 or 80 pound, of potash there just to make sure if I'm using this left side of a standard, just so we don't mind those numbers any. And then we get to calcium, and so this is where I start to look for a base saturation, but I think one anecdotal story is when I first started in retail, when I got out of college, we would get soil tests back and we never even got base saturation numbers. They did not exist in our reports. The people the kind of the powers that be thought that farmers aren't using that, they're not paying attention to that number, so there's no reason to put it there. It was amazing when I saw the first base saturation number, that changed my mindset on a soil sample as well. But so I was kind of honestly glossed over the calcium, the mag numbers, and then I looked down to the micronutrients on here. And realistically, there's some useful information with your micros, but also I've kind of always believed that soil testing for a micro is kind of tricky. It's maybe not the most accurate information, but I think the key take home, if you're looking at just a standard soil test, is look at, let's say use sulfur, for example. Sulfur, boron are two nutrients that get a lot of play in our world. I look at that 7.6 parts per million, that tells me 15 pound to the acre. In my sandier soils, I say that's low. So, whether or not I trust that number to be incredibly accurate, I can look at that and say, okay, we need to apply some sulfur. I see 0.7 parts per million boron, I know, and we know from doing other analysis in tissue that basically a boron level at a 0.7, we're going to be applying some boron in season and trying to get those numbers up. So you may not trust the micro numbers as maybe the gospel, but if they're really low on a soil test, they're probably going to be really low and not getting those into the plant. And then finally, I'm looking at the bottom at pH, and we've got a 7.2 pH in this case, so I just kind of ballpark, I'm not going to spread any lime. I'm not going to pay much attention to that number in most cases until I see it get below 6.5 and maybe below 6 and into the 5s. If we had a pH below 7, in this case, we would get a buffer pH number. And that's how we really determine, how much lime we're going to apply. Another kind of funny anecdotal thing is the University of Illinois Agronomy Handbook does not use buffer pH to determine lime. It's basically using organic matter and some numbers and some voodoo magic, and we create a lime recommendation that way. So always get that base saturation because that's really the best way to kind of determine what we're going to do with lime.
So as we transition from the explanation of a standard chemical soil test and how do you use it, right? For those of you, again, and I've referenced this a lot because I've talked about it since day one of coming here to Biodyne, the reason that we use an indicator soil sample is because the definition of soil is physical, chemical, and biological. And my frustration is that the industry has widely adapted and used just the chemical standpoint. So we've only really looked at our soils chemically only. So if you want to break it out on an even percentage, it's 33%, right? So we're making recommendations for fertility that in a year like this year, we're talking $250 to $300 an acre for a 2-year spread off of just looking at 1/3 of the soil. So this is where we bring in the biological and the physical piece. So if you will follow along here, I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to kind of give you some numbers, what they are, what they mean, and what can we do to change that. So the very top number that you see there is HT3 24-hour CO2 burst. So that is a measurement of biological respiration, right? So that is just giving us an idea of how active that soil is from the release of carbon dioxide through biological activity. The very next one is VAST. So that's a measurement of soil structure, soil aggregation, soil stability. Okay, so that's telling us, is that soil tightly compacted, or is that soil going to allow roots to penetrate and move through there? So a VAS score of 31 is a fairly impressive VAS score. I've seen VAS scores as low as 3 in our environments. I've seen them as high as 45 in our environments. You typically see those 45 and above VAS scores on soils that have been long-term no-till or cover crops, things like that. If you're in a tillage rotation, it's awful hard to get that VAS score above that 40, 45 mark from what I've seen. The next one, what we're looking at is H2O nitrate. So that's water-soluble nitrate. So if anything, just a quick reminder, if this is the first time you've ever had it explained, anything ATE is leachable, right? Sulfate, phosphate, nitrate, okay? So anything in that nitrate form, so this would be NO3 minus, right? A negative charge, it would be an anion. Your soils are negatively charged, right? So there's nothing to hold that ion there. So we get a heavy rain event, we have 16 pounds of nitrate sitting in the soil system that could be leached through that profile and out the tile lines. This is a soil sample. I should have said this is a soil sample behind corn this year. It was a 200 bushel corn crop pulled off of this. This is a limestone underlay, which probably gives us a little bit of indication onto that 7.2 pH.
Sure.
It's got some topsoil, but there is a limestone gravel underlay underneath this soil.
What's your lime history on this farm?
Yeah, so we haven't put lime on this in over 6 years, and we have been, and we'll talk more about this farm. This is a field that we've done. It's my home farm. That we've done something a little bit unique here. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that we've not put lime on in 6 years. And that's coming from previously, we would be on a 2-year soil sample, and we would typically spread, lime as they called for. Turn around soil sample the next 2 years, put lime as they called for, and we were traditionally about 185 pounds of MAP and 310, 315 pounds of potash for a 2-year spread with a 200 bushel corn crop, 210 with a 60 bushel bean crop.
Sure.
So we move down to H2O ammoniacal. So that's anything that would be ammonium nitrogen. So that's NH4. So that's a positive or a cation. So that's pretty safe, right? Unless that gets converted. But as we cool down, we know that your nitrifying bacteria are also going to cool down. So whatever's in that ammoniacal form is pretty well safe for the wintertime. So we have 2.5 pounds of ammoniacal nitrogen sitting in the soil. SLAN is slow labile amino nitrogen. So what that is that's a biological function or form of nitrogen. So it's already in a protein form. It's an amino acid. There's no conversion necessary. It's a very, very, very efficient form of nitrogen. So the higher that number on your SLAN, what that is telling you is how efficient your soil is at creating or releasing biological nitrogen. The next one we look at is C to N, so that's the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And I think one of the things that maybe is most misunderstood with the carbon to nitrogen ratio is that you could Google or look at any agronomy handbook and see the different carbon to nitrogen ratios of residue, right?
Right.
And so you bring soybeans or you bring corn or you bring wheat, and so you get it in your head, okay, well, if that's a 56 to 1, then my soil should be a 56 to 1.
Right.
But as you can see here, this is a 6.6. So what is this telling us? Your carbon to nitrogen ratio is, that number is from taking your organic in, so right below it, divided by your WEOC, and that is what gets you your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So take your organic in divided by 2, divided by WEOC, and that is where your carbon to nitrogen ratio is. So a question that you might have, if this is the first time that you've had it explained to you is okay, that's great, but what am I doing with that, right? What is that data telling me? Well, what it tells me is that if I went and applied nitrogen, let's say it's 150 pounds, that nitrogen is going to be released earlier in the growing season rather than later in the growing season. So my soils are not going to really act like a stabilizer, if you will. If I have soluble or available nitrogen, it's going to be released fairly early. If I start getting upwards of 13, 15, 16, 17 on a carbon to nitrogen ratio, I know that I need to ban some early season nitrogen because I'm not going to get that availability.
Right.
My soils are going to hold on to it. As we move down into organic N, so that is N that is not plant available. So you see WEON there just to the right. That's water extractable organic nitrogen. So that is nitrogen that is going to be, that needs to be converted before it ever gets recognized as being plant available. So inorganic N is just taking your H2O nitrate added with your H2O ammoniacal, and that gives you your plant available. So we have 18.7 pounds of total plant available in today. You move below that, that's our MAC-WEON, so that's your microbial activity, water extractable organic nitrogen. Move below that is your WEOC, so WEOC. So WEOC is your water extractable organic carbon, which is the available carbon or the food source that drives the entire biological system. There's been some tremendous work done out of Penn State where they looked at biological activity and organic matter. I think that the industry wants to make organic matter maybe too big of a deal or a bigger deal than what it actually is.
Right.
And the R value was 0.47. So there was no consistency with biological respiration and organic matter. However, when compared to WEOC, that R value went to an 87. So significantly closer correlation, and that is why we use WEOC, looking at the biological side of the soils.
So if we stop right here for a second on this nitrogen section and just real quick on, say, a nitrogen recommendation on this soil sample. And I think this is something that we want to go deeper into as we go through the series. But if we just look at this test right here, Bodie, what do you see? I see a 35 SLAN, I see a 6,6 carbon and nitrogen, and I've got 38 pounds of estimated nitrogen release. So if you're going to apply nitrogen based on this sample right now, just real quick, are you putting it up front? Are you side dressing some of this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we talk about, and I think it can't be dismissed, is agronomics, economics, and logistics, right? It's something that we talk an awful lot about, and it's one that we stay very true to. So what do I mean by that? I mean that agronomically I may come with one recommendation. Economically may force me to another.
Sure.
And logistics may force me to another. And so we have to look at that grower, and we have to look at what is his equipment, right? What is the equipment availability? What is his manpower availability? Can he side dress? Can he not? And that's where we have to work, and that's where this system becomes extremely more complicated and not just cut and dry. The easy answer would be is the grower puts all of his nitrogen up front typically, so let's do it, and that's what we're going to do.
Right.
If we're looking at this data and we're going to pretend that he's got the manpower, right, and that everything is on the table, for me, I would look at putting a little bit of nitrogen up front early to get it started. My CN is not super low, a 2 or a 3 carbon to nitrogen ratio, so my soils are going to hold on to that a little bit.
Sure.
So I want a little bit, whether that's 2x2, whether that's weed and feed, whether that's a dry broadcast of some AMS incorporated in, whatever it might be. I would look at getting a little bit of nitrogen there early. Then I would look at coming back and side dressing. And the reason that I would be looking at side dressing is simply because our soils, if we give them the opportunity to put 150 or 180 pounds of nitrogen in that soil, it's going to release sooner rather than later.
Sure.
So I want to make sure that I've got enough nitrogen extended into grain fill to prolong that grain fill period and make sure that I can keep that plant alive and healthy. So in a perfect world, it's a little shoddy of in early, come back and side dress, or maybe it's a V8Y drop if this grower does. For example, on our farm, we do not have a high clearance sprayer. We do not have Y drops available, so side dress would have to be the best option for us.
Well, I think the reason I brought that up, and it's not to sidetrack us off of what we're talking about, but it's how we're using these advanced metrics on this indicator to help us make decisions that we don't get from a standard soil test. We're looking at that nitrogen section, and as we analyze our fields, if we see more of that across the farm as we pull these tests, then maybe we start to look at what equipment we need, what we need to do to put in place to maybe look at things a little differently than what we have in the past.
100%. 100%. So as we move from nitrogen, that top section being focused on microbial activity, soil structure, and then nitrogen, we move into phosphorus, and this is where things get a little bit interesting for me. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, Sean talked about, I got a 35.1 part per million Bray, right? Or 70 pounds if you're in Illinois. And we come over here to the H3AP and it's showing 16.5. Well, how could we have a discrepancy of 19 part per million or 38 pounds here? And if you're asking yourself that, I'm glad that you did. Let me help you understand that. So on the left-hand side of a chemical extract, and this is not, please don't take this as any sort of slight of any sort of me attacking the standard soil test. This is just reality. A malic, a bray, and Olsen extract are harsher acids that exist in soil, right? We're not going to have a lot of bray acids or ammonium acetate, if you will, that's released by that plant. So what we look at, and when we come up with an H3A reading, is that's using root exudates and deionized water as the extraction. So a much softer acid for an extract. So that's going to, this number, when you see H3A, anytime you see H3A, whether it's phosphorus, potassium, calcium, iron, or aluminum, that is simply telling us what that plant recognizes at that time.
Sure.
Okay, so it's looking at it at that time, what is the plant recognizing as available phosphorus? So that's where your discrepancy comes from. That's where your chemical soil test versus what is more biological, what is actually plant available, that's where your discrepancy comes from. So as you break through that, we've got 14.1 part per million in an inorganic, so that would be readily plant available. We have 2.4 part per million in the organic phosphorus, so we're going to need to convert organic to inorganic. Gives us 33.7 pounds of available P2O5. This next one, P saturation, might be the first time that you've ever seen that. So what is P saturation? That is your total available P divided by all potential tie-ups. Right, so we think about that. We know that phosphorus is negatively charged, which makes it what? An anion, right? We know that calcium is a positive charge, which makes it a cation, right? We also know that iron and aluminum are also cations, right? So that number is looking at your total available P divided by your calciums, divided by your iron and aluminums to show you how much of that is available, right? What percent is available that's not going to be tied up. As we move down into potassium, we'll cut this.
Just click.
So as we move into potassium, we see an H3A of K. So Sean described a little bit earlier. We have 151 part per million potassium. In his soils, that would be, a go to zero, if you will, right?
Sure.
You said you might put a little bit of a, 75 or 80 pounds, make sure that K is not your limiting factor. But we come over here to the H3A and we're looking at a 40. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells me, if I'm looking at this soil sample, that if I'm under really 65 or 70, that I'm going to have to apply some supplemental potash because the soil's not going to replace itself efficiently enough. I start getting 65 and above on a ppm H3AK, I know that that soil has the ability to replenish itself with the pool of available potassium.
Sure.
Right? We move down into calcium. We're at 414 part per million, and you see that that's a low reading. In an ideal world, for me, if I could get that into the 600s, that's a really good day. That is a number that is extremely difficult. You think about it, right? We have 2,600 and 66 pounds, so call it almost 2,700 for easy math. So 5,400 pounds. Excuse me, that was part per million. So 5,400, 52, 5,300 pounds. Yet I only have 800 pounds that is plant available.
Well, that's interesting, Bodie, because you got a pH of 7.2, so that says we don't need any lime, and you're telling me I need calcium, and generally the way I get calcium is by spreading more lime.
Correct. Correct. So this is where, so what would be some available calcium sources that you could look at, right? Are we above that 65% base sat? The answer is yes, we are. Gypsum comes into play. If I need to try to drive that calcium, H3A calcium number, then gypsum is the source that I'm going to use. I don't want to use lime because I don't want to make my pH any higher than what it already is. Then we move down, you can see your iron and aluminum. Those being very low, that's a good thing. That just tells us that we don't have iron and aluminum that's going to tie up our phosphorus. And iron and aluminum typically shows up in low pHs, which makes perfect sense. As your soil gets more acidic, iron and aluminum become way more active.
Right.
We're at a 7.2, it's not going to be very active, which means that it's not coming up and it's not tying up our phosphorus. So all we have to work through really is our calcium tying up our phosphorus.
That's right.
Right? And how do we do that? So we look down here, we're at a 17 CEC, 2.3 base sat K, 19.7 base sat mag, 77.7 base sat calcium, and a sodium of 0.3. Now, you could be looking at this and you could say, boy, your K levels are sure in the tank, right?
Sure.
Well, how can I change that? How can I make that to 6 or 7 or some people even saying you got to get to 10? Well, how am I going to do that? Well, if you're asking that at home, stay tuned, because here in the next couple of minutes, we're actually going to go to the whiteboard and we're going to look at base saturations and really how to manipulate them, how to change them, but what it's really telling us.
Sure.
That's what we're going to go through. A little bit of a backstory on this farm that I got to share. So this is, like I said, this is a home farm for us. This has been 5 years of continuous corn. It has been a cereal rye cover crop after each one of those corn crops. We then graze about 40 cows on 40 acres. The interesting thing about this is that we've not applied any synthetic phosphorus in 5 years. Okay? So you might be saying, okay, well, you must have started with a Bray P1 of 70
right.
if you haven't applied any phosphorus.
Are you mining that soil?
Because we've been told that mines our soils, right? If you don't apply synthetic fertilizer, then you're going to mine that soil. In fact, it's actually just the opposite. I was looking at these samples back to some samples from 5 years ago, and we were actually in that 15 to 17 part per million range. And our soils are actually building. And in the last 2 years, we have used Meltdown and 401 on this farm, and our numbers have actually climbed significantly more in the last 2 years. So I don't want to dismiss this, right? And I don't want this to just be all about product, but I also am a guy that let the data tell you what it is and look at the data, understand it. So for 3 years, we've had cattle on this system. We've seen a gradual increase in our phosphorus, on the standard soil test, right? But over the last 2 years, when using the cattle and the corn and the cover crops and bringing in beneficial microbes, that number has exponentially increased. This is something that I was showing my dad, as we were talking about this with fertilizer prices getting high. He said, I want to see what else I can cut, right? If I'm going to continue to use Meltdown and 401, what else can I cut? And so I took the time and I walked him through and I said, Dad, for 5 years, you haven't put any phosphorus on this. In that same time, in 5 years, we've only put 75 pounds of potash. For 5 years, being corn on corn with a cover crop, we've been over 200 bushels. Previous to the 5 years, our best yield on that farm was a 198. Now, I told you it's a light river bottom with a gravel underlay, that even in a wet year, you can still see some dry spots show up. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at is that through the use of, one, understanding our soils, that they're not just chemically, understanding that there is a biological component to it, and bringing in beneficial microbes and understanding the environment that you're working with, adding livestock in, we're seeing things that we didn't think, or that we've been taught couldn't happen. Right? Because we're taught that if you don't put removal rates on, or removal plus some, that we're going to mine that soil. And reality is we're actually getting stronger. We continue to get stronger.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that is phenomenal. Obviously, you've got the beneficial microbes that you're applying with the Meltdown, the 401. You've got the cereal rye doing something. You've got a little bit of manure from your cattle.
Yep.
All right. So you're getting a lot of biological processes happening. You look at our phosphorus numbers, and your Bray is increasing, right? And so we look at our H3A phos, and you'd say, well, okay, well, maybe we need to apply a little here. Well, I think this comes back to your Meltdown 401 conversation, right? Is when you talk about that extraction, like you did, deionized water, root exudates, and then we look at the Bray, which is a little bit more of maybe like a hammer and chisel, trying to knock some of that phos off there.
Yep.
We know that phosphorus is released to us by biological activity.
Yep.
So you're increasing it with your 401, you're increasing that with your Meltdown, and then you've got root activity happening. So even the native biology are doing some different things out there. You're getting biology in the manure. You're making. Basically, what's happening is it's not look at one, look at the other, decide which one you want to be. You realize that the difference between your Bray and your H3A is what's really available out there, and we're using the biology to make that phos more available. You're seeing similar things with your potassium. You're getting some of that, your biology maybe making some more of that K available. That's why your K numbers aren't doing anything drastic that you wouldn't expect.
So, Sean, this is something, I've heard. We've obviously referenced the Agronomy 365 platform. This is a fall soil sample. If I got a fall soil sample and I can look at this, why do I need to take anything in season? Like what are we taking in season that we're not getting with a fall soil sample today? And why are we so adamant about taking a soil and a tissue paired together?
Well, I think that's a good question because we want to validate. All right, so we're going to use this. We're going to make a plan. You've made your plan. Now we want to validate to make sure that was the right plan. And every year is a little bit different, right? But if we take that in-season soil, we see the things that we change. You know, I think even from the nitrogen perspective, if we're looking at if we've got a load of organic N out there, we know that that's not plant available. We're doing things to try to, as opposed to maybe just, you know, putting an extra 50 pounds of nitrogen out there. What are we doing? Can we make that organic N available? Can we convert that to inorganic N that's available to our crops?
Well, how are you going to do that? How are you going to take non-plant available nitrogen and make it available?
I'm going to use meltdown, and I'm going to use biology to do that.
So you're telling me that you're taking a soil sample to prove out products that the industry calls snake oils. Aren't you afraid that it could show something that you don't want to see?
Am I afraid? No. Is that possible? Yes. Not every. This is the whole point. Is a soil sample, whether it's a standard or whether it's the indicator complete, is a snapshot in time. That soil, you know, we think about it when we're making fertilizer recommendations that we just think about it in pounds and tons. All right. That number's this. We're going to apply this. That number's this. We're going to apply that. It's a living, breathing creature just like you or I. So it's not going to always do what we expect it to do. You know, it's impossible to take something living and run a mathematical calculation and say if we do X, we get Y, right? And so if we can validate that in season and we can see where we're hitting it right, maybe where we're hitting it a little bit off, and it gives us an opportunity. Maybe we don't, maybe we're not equipped, maybe we don't have the ability to make changes while that crop is growing, but we can use that information with our planned samples, our fall samples, or if you're a spring sampler, however you sample, we can use those things to make that plan better going forward and try to improve on what we do, as opposed to just kind of doing what we've always done. Maybe, you know, once we spread our fertilizer and walk away and say, okay, that's what the crop's got to eat, this gives us an ability to see what's becoming available, what we can do to change that as we go forward.
Well, I feel like that you hit on a couple things, and now you probably have got people just sitting on by the edge of their seat here and wondering for more. You said something in there that you said something about organic N. And if I had a big pool of organic N, instead of applying 50 more pounds of nitrogen, you're going to use biology
Sure.
to react that?
Yeah, we've seen that because our biology didn't say a product like Meltdown. And Meltdown's a good option for there because Meltdown's thing is it's kind of known as a residue degrader, right? It releases things from residue, it breaks down the residue and makes, you know, whether tillage is easier to apply. I look at it as it's releasing nutrients back to the plant, right? And if I have organic N in the fall and I don't have any living roots, so I don't have a crop out there to capture what it releases, then it can theoretically be complex back in the soil. Right? Now, if I'm after residue degradation, that's exactly what I want it to do. But if I look at if I have an organic N in the soil and I see that and I say, okay, I need this to convert to inorganic, then I might use a product such as Meltdown that degrades residues and releases nutrients back to the soil. And if I can do that, I can convert organic N to inorganic N and make that plant available. And that can happen in the course of a season. You can do that while the crop is growing and get that benefit that same year.
Okay, hold on. We started talking about a soil test, trying to help these guys understand what a soil test was, trying to take them through that. And you just dropped a knowledge bomb like that. We can't put this in the same episode. We got this, surely we have to expand on this, right?
Well,
like, is this something, are you telling me that you could talk about Meltdown and you could talk about from a scientific level of how you can prove it to me, right? If I'm a skeptic, I want to know how you know that your microbes are converting organic N to inorganic N, right? I want to know, you can talk that through?
Sure, I think we can, because I think what happens is if you actively see that, then let's say you have a large pool of organic N, right? And we've seen customers do this, right? This is why we have confidence to say this, is we have a large pool of organic N, and if that grower says, well, my tissue isn't what I want it to be on nitrogen or something like that. I believe you made a recommendation on a case just like this, where you had a large pool of organic N, the grower wanted to make a nitrogen application because he wasn't seeing maybe what he wanted to see in his tissue. You made an application, I think you wide drop Meltdown, you place Meltdown in the rhizosphere, so you're placing that right by the roots because realistically, if we're going to make something available, we want it to be available where the roots are. You know, it doesn't matter if we do something right in the middle of the row, if it's late in the season, we may not have an opportunity to capture that. So you wide drop the meltdown, and you pulled the same soil test, you know, I think a couple weeks later, and you realize that not only did your pool of inorganic N go down because your plant's still growing, your crop is still growing. So, you know, just like a straw, that crop of corn was still pulling that nitrogen out of the soil, but also you saw, I think, like a 50-pound reduction in that organic N pool. And so while I can't, you know, I don't live in the soil, I don't know what exactly happened, I'm gonna deduct, you know, my hypothesis is you had a pool of organic N, you made an application of meltdown, which is a consortium of biology that releases nutrients, makes them plant available, and 2 weeks later pulled the same soil test, and your organic N pool was reduced by 50 pounds, and your tissue number didn't change, it didn't go down, your inorganic number went down, so we know the plant's using that, and yeah, so I believe that the data is proving what we're talking about.
All right. This is definitely another episode because I got a lot of questions that I'm curious now on. I feel like we talked a little bit about base sats, but we ran out of time. We can't describe it right now. I think we ought to go to the whiteboard. I don't know about you, I'm a visual guy.
Sure.
Let's go to the whiteboard. Let's break down base saturations. Let's break down how we could build fertility, how we could maintain fertility, and how that works.
And then maybe do another episode. It sounds like we need to do another episode just talking about biology and nitrogen and phosphorus and some of these things.
I'm down with that.
Sounds great.